All right, the title of my talk, Against Human Rights. Are they a blunt tool for grassroots struggles in highly marginalized settings? Human rights approaches, as we all know, dominate the landscape of public health and social development policies and interventions across sub-Saharan Africa. Yet much remains to be known how they're viewed by the communities that they're designed to serve. In the academy, intellectuals are divided around the value of human rights strategies. And my talk evaluates these debates in the light of case studies of human rights approaches in action in relation to three settings: South Africa, Zambia, and Uganda, in programs seeking to promote human rights as a pathway to gender equality, an end to domestic violence, and the reduction of HIV/AIDS. The aim of my talk, as you'll see, is to provoke questions rather than provide answers. But I will argue that there's an urgent need for human rights programs to engage in more careful dialogue with vulnerable groups, rather than using the current one-size-fits-all conceptualization of rights. African writers are divided in the literature on human rights, with some seeing them as vital tools for holding states accountable to delivering entitlements such as healthcare, education, and so on. And people cite the successes of human rights-based campaigns in South Africa, for example, the anti-apartheid struggle, the Treatment Action Campaign, the Fees Must Fall campaign, and so on and so forth. However, in my own field, my experience of projects to advance the health of children, women, and people with HIV/AIDS, invocations of rights are often regarded with irritation in settings in sub-Saharan Africa. I was at a recent meeting in Nairobi, for example, where a European colleague suggested using a rights-based framework to guide an intervention with vulnerable children. Kenyan colleagues responded with irritation, saying that there's no such thing as rights without resources. And this is a view echoed in literature, where some argue that the emphasis on individual civil and political rights obscures the role of poverty and the lack of political will in making the delivery of rights-based entitlements unlikely or impossible. Still others view human rights approaches as the neo-colonial imposition of Western ideals and norms onto non-Western cultures. Thus, for example, Mutua says that human rights are part of a wider agenda to impose culturally biased norms and practices in non-Western settings, as part of what he calls the wider colonial civilizing mission. And he links them, and I quote, to the European colonial project, in which actors are cast into superior and subordinate positions. And working in both Nigeria and South Africa, Undi and Izugbara explain frequent African hostility to international rights activists through the mismatch between, on the one hand, Western views of rights as properties of abstract individuals, and on the other, more relational understandings of rights and entitlements in many African settings. And I quote from their article, "Indigenous understandings of rights are activated through people's engagement in social relations in everyday contexts, rather than through appeals to abstract and universalized individual human existence." This was a theme in Ursula Reid's study of the chaining of the mad in Ghana. In rural Ghana, it's common for psychotic family members who are violent and aggressive to be chained up outside the house as a way of containing them. This has generated a great deal of protest and activity from Western human rights organizations concerned with the individual rights of the chained. Reid's research suggested that local people saw collective rights to safety and survival as more important than individual rights of the sick, and felt that the chaining was very much justified in terms of the risk to the safety of other people in the community. And Reid concludes that programs would probably have been more useful had they worked with local people to develop alternative ways of containing the mad, rather than seeking to educate rural people in individualistic notions of human rights. On a slight tangent, but an important one, legal scholars argue that while every human being has moral claims, these only become rights when they're enforceable. Namely, when those with political and economic power to deliver them recognize the legitimacy of rights claims and acknowledge their obligations to the claimants. In the absence of such recognition, it's sometimes argued that appeals to human rights may be little more than nonsense on stilts. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, against that background, the aim of my paper today is to present 3 case studies of human rights approaches in action. Programs seeking to facilitate women's rights in South Africa, the rights of HIV vulnerable groups in Zambia, and the rights of women in violent marriages in Uganda. Let me start off with my first study, which was conducted with colleagues Yugi Naya and Spongile Maimane, who are both in the pictures on the screen, who were colleagues at the Centre for HIV/AIDS Networking at the University of Natal in Durban, where I was based as a visiting scholar for a number of years. And together we published a paper entitled From Rhetoric to Reality, Putting HIV/AIDS Rights into Practice in a South African Rural Community, which I'll draw on in talking about this program. In this paper, we argue that translation of universal rights talk into practice in specific settings remains a challenge, asking how useful rights claims are for advancing progressive social change in resource-poor and often non-Western contexts in which HIV/AIDS often flourishes. Community mobilization is often the strategy of choice for rights programs. And against this background, we looked at the Entabeni project, which was a community program run by a foreign-funded NGO, namely the HIV/AIDS Networking Center that I was part of at the University of Natal, and female volunteers in a deep rural community. And the program sought to increase women's rights and rights to health. Just briefly, the background: Entabeni is 30 kilometers from the nearest town or health facilities in northern KZN. Residents have limited or no access to basic health or welfare services, no clean roads, no clean water, and few accessible roads, high adult illiteracy, unemployment, and poverty. And 36% of pregnant women are HIV positive. We were involved in this community from 2003 to 2013. And certainly at the time that we started working in the community, antiretroviral therapy was not rolled out yet, so that HIV/AIDS was a death sentence for the people who were affected by it. In this very challenging context, we found that informal care, mostly by female volunteers, was the only support available to people dying of HIV/AIDS. This group worked for no pay, with little or no training, having to walk long distances on foot up steep hills, often in searing heat, to households which may be several kilometers apart, only to be turned away by families who denied that they had HIV-positive family members in the household due to stigma. Their work was often arduous in nature, including fetching wood and water, cooking, cleaning patients, and in extreme cases, supervising the transport of patients in wheelbarrows or on the backs of relatives to distant access roads to seek transport to nearest hospitals 30 kilometers away. Okay, after conducting baseline research in the community and feeding back our research findings, we were invited by the community through the traditional chief, but particularly by the female volunteers, to partner them in a program with 3 strategies. Firstly, to strengthen the existing volunteer teams through skills building, training in home nursing, peer education, bereavement counseling, and so on and so forth. Secondly, to building partnerships between the community with outside agencies in the public and NGO sectors. And thirdly, strengthening local support structures for volunteers. Let's look at how we progressed with these strategies. The first strategy, building volunteer skills, was relatively successful and easy to implement. Over 3 years, the project was very successful in training volunteers in counseling, home nursing, assisting people to access hard-to-reach welfare grants, and so on. This training led to the tremendous increase in the effectiveness of home nursing services and the provision of quality care over a 3-year period to households that were really battling. So there was no doubt that in welfare terms, the project was extremely successful. However, in relation to our Hivan's kind of social development mission, it failed to serve as a springboard for what we'd hoped for, namely the development of skills and confidence of this group of women to lead on an expanded local AIDS response. In relation to building public sector and NGO support, the project had very good links with 2 tiny local NGOs. One was a branch, in fact, of Lifeline, run by a British businesswoman, and they did it at no cost, a lot of training of the volunteers. And the other one was a kind of AIDS NGO run by a Scandinavian missionary who funded and organized many of the program events and was a vital help. So the project really depended very heavily on these two NGOs for a lot of its activities. But these were very small organizations living hand to mouth from funds from Norway and Britain that were kind of unpredictable. The women were both not terribly young, so this was not a sustainable strategy for continuing the program at the end of Highland's 3-year period, and it was very clear that we would be there for 3 years. Okay, in terms of building public sector support, despite monumental efforts, the project failed to establish long-term partnerships with local government bodies, including health, welfare, and municipality. Despite very enthusiastic principled agreement to participate in the project at the beginning, this enthusiasm failed to turn into any long-term involvement. Public sector agencies were overworked and under-resourced. Hierarchical work structures prevented them from being responsive to the needs of small grassroots communities. The junior staff in hierarchical public sector organizations, who were often the ones that had the greatest contact with and insight into the community, were not encouraged to feed their views into their public sector organizations by hierarchical bosses who didn't welcome suggestions from younger people. Many personnel lacked the personal motivation to engage with poor people as equals, particularly poor women. And this was a problem, this was really a problem for the social development side of the project, because its success, as anticipated, would be totally dependent on increased public sector involvement for 3 reasons. Firstly, the project proposal had been to gradually institutionalize it by handing over coordination from Highland to public sector employees and agencies over 3 years. Secondly, it relied heavily on increasing people's access to primary healthcare and hospitals. And finally, and most importantly, it had envisaged being a pathway to stipends for the volunteers, who were all working, very poor women, working out of their own pockets to take food, transport, and so on and so forth. And the issue of stipends was really key, because in inviting Highland to participate in the project at the beginning, the volunteers' key motivation had been that Highland would insist them in getting hold of government stipends. And in fact, there were a lot at the time of announcements made on public television that the government would provide stipends, and the women duly went along to the public health agencies in the nearest township, and they were told that they couldn't get stipends unless they formed a non-governmental organization. So women who didn't have access to pencils or paper or great literacy went through the whole arduous 6-month process of setting themselves up as an NGO, and they went back to their offices only to be told that in fact they'd only get the stipend if they had matric certificates, which none of them had. I'll take this point up in a moment, but it was a key obstacle to the furthering of the project. What had happened was that when we got there, this group of women had been working for 5 years. And in our baseline research, they said that really they couldn't keep going with it any longer. It was too difficult, it was too expensive for them. They didn't feel they had the support of the community, they didn't feel they had the support of the public sector. But anyway, more about that in a moment. Okay, in terms of creating local support for the project, and the women had said that it was particularly difficult to work with a highly stigmatized epidemic where people didn't recognize or value their work, the project was successful in building very strong links with the church. It built good links with the traditional chief, who was the gatekeeper to the community. Nothing could have happened without him. But this was a kind of ambiguous sort of form of support, because he was very much determined from the moment we went into the community that it would remain apolitical. And for him, apolitical was doing anything which would threaten his Inkatha power base and advance the interests of the ANC. And he saw projects to empower women as being pro-ANC rather than supportive of Inkatha. So that became very complicated. His style of engagement, which was an enthusiastic and supportive, was often at odds with the project goals. So, for example, he often used speeches at project events as a forum for celebrating his own masculinity, frequently referring to his 6 wives and 5 girlfriends, expressing the view that he didn't think that multiple partners was a driver of HIV/AIDS, etc., etc. Involving men was a problem. Men really were, community men were just a continual drain on the women's efforts. They continually denigrated women for consenting to work for no money. They felt that the whole notion of volunteering was lacking in dignity. They were dismissive of those who praised the women for doing the caring work, saying that caring was something that women did and really was not remarkable. And finally, they opposed the project's message of partner reduction and condom use. There was also resistance to women's leadership. When the chief invited us into the community and the project was set up, we were very clear that this was going to be a women's leadership, women's rights sort of program. That's what the volunteers wanted, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, what he did at the beginning was he said, well, just at the beginning, I'll appoint a trusted head man to run the volunteer organization. And the very explicit contract was that over time, the head man would gradually pass control of the project back to the women. But in fact, over the three-year program, it didn't happen. And there were continual meetings where people said, well, when are you going to hand over power? And he said, next meeting, next meeting. It just didn't happen. And in some sense, an NGO who was there at the invitation of the traditional chief didn't have the power to push back enough against that. Finally, the interface between the project and the funders. We in Highvan had been able to get money for what we thought was a 3-year period from a US government funding agency, AIDS funding agency. And initially, they were happy to support the project in an organic bottom-up program. But after 1 year, we received an embarrassed call from a funding intermediary in Pretoria who said that the funder was no longer willing to support the project. And I quote from Yugi's diary, apparently there's a new person that had been employed in the grants procurement office who's very rigid and old school. She sees deliverables purely in terms of what would have direct benefit for US government and US government policy. And when my colleague tried to argue that we were being very successful in empowering poor rural women to take control of their health in a remote community, she said, and I quote, that outcomes of this nature were not a deliverable of value to the US government. After that, we managed to get funding for bits and pieces. We got the funding for the 3 years over time, but there was a very definite setback at the beginning. And I think what was also very undermining for women in a women's empowerment project was that the funding seemed to arrive out of the sky and then to seem to disappear back into the sky. And there was a sense of no sense of funder accountability to the community. You know, the funders were accountable to stakeholders in Washington, D.C., and they were the ones who tended to determine what could be done. Okay, just to make 2 concluding comments before I go on to my other case studies. The wider context of this work was an emphasis on women's rights and international AIDS rhetoric, and our focus was a social development program that sought to empower women through facilitating their leadership of AIDS work. And I think our finding was, in short, that interactions between key actors within and outside the community made it very unlikely that women would be willing to demand their rights, or that more powerful groups, in this case local men, the traditional leader, public sector and foreign donors, would support them in doing so, both being preconditions, I would argue, for the effective use of rights as tools for advancing gender equality and community health. The project illustrated lack of 2 preconditions for an effective human rights claim: the absence of a marginalised group who are willing to assert their rights, and a context where powerful people are willing to support these claims. And in such a context, we argue that rights may be a blunt tool for HIV work with women in deeply oppressive and remote rural communities, beyond the reach of international treaties and urban-based activist movements, which really generated the rights concept as a framework for health work. Okay, my second concluding comment relates to the fact that 3 or 4 years after the project had finished, Highvan went back to the community to interview women to see what degree the work had been sustainable, to find out that the organizational structure had folded and that very few women were still doing the work. And when women were interviewed, they argued that when all was said and done, it was the failure to procure the stipend that had led to the project's failure to generate community respect and support for their work, and led to a gradual erosion of volunteer commitment, morale, and motivation, leading to the abandonment of the work once Highvan withdrew. Volunteers' prioritization of their material needs echoes Cornwall's study of marginalized women all over the world in the Pathways report in 2011, where she argues that women's ability to exercise voice and strategic control over their lives is linked to being able to generate regular and independent sources of income. And Harry England's claim that political rights are meaningless in the absence of material entitlements, politics at the expense of poverty. I'll move to my second study, which was conducted with my colleague Chulwe Muziamba in Zambia and Eleanor Broadus, who's at Johns Hopkins. And we published this in BMC Human Rights in a paper that came out at the end of last year, You Cannot Eat Rights. More about that in a moment. Here we did interviews with NGOs using human rights program to work with women, young people, and men who have sex with men, and we interviewed and did focus groups with all 4 groups. In interviews, NGO workers were ambivalent about the value of human rights as an HIV prevention framework. They said that they battled to tailor the approach to the Zambian context, where it conflicted with highly valued cultural priorities. They said that human rights work had led to strong resistance by social elders and men in many communities, who had then sought to sabotage community programs that they disapproved of. They felt resentful at being forced to implement what they called locally unworkable human rights frameworks because of decisions by Western funders who they said had, and I quote, absolutely no clue. And in addition, they were hampered by Zambia's weak political and legal system, which they said failed to uphold people's legal rights when they had the courage to assert them. In focus group discussions, young people saw messages of rights-based NGOs as corrosive of highly valued cultural, religious, and economic interests. And I quote, "We have cultural codes. They are making us fight against the people who feed us, take care of us. You cannot eat rights when your father chases you away from his home, can you?" And young Zambian NGO workers, mostly university qualified and well paid in their jobs, were seen as out of touch with the realities of the typical Zambian youth, often with less education and unemployed. Young people called for human rights NGOs to develop what they called indigenous and Zambian solutions through dialogue to incorporate priorities and ideas of the youth they were trying to serve. Similarly, in focus groups, most women saw human rights approaches as conflicting with highly valued traditional relationships with parents and husbands. And I quote, "These NGOs come and tell us that times have changed, that we must adopt Mzungu culture. Yet as girls growing up, we're taught that your husband is the most important person in your life. Whatever happens, you have a need to ensure he is well served. What kind of African woman would deny her husband sex if he wished it?" They too noted that women NGO workers were mostly unmarried and educated and had a poor understanding of the issues and priorities of the average Zambian woman. From an economic viewpoint, NGO efforts to suggest that they challenge their husbands were seen as outrageous, and I quote, "They tell us to report our husbands who beat us so they can be arrested. I find this highly illogical, that we should take the people caring for ourselves and our kids to the police. And when they get arrested, who will take care of us? That is how disorganized their message is." One woman commented that challenging her husband would result in him throwing her out onto the streets, where she would be forced to sell her body to survive. "It seems obvious to me that this increases the chance of my getting HIV, more than having to tolerate a husband who slaps me once in a while. This rights talk is very superficial." In very strong contrast, men who have sex with men were overwhelmingly positive about human rights approaches. They saw and spoke very eloquently of human rights approaches as offering them their first experience of solidarity, social respect, and hope for the future. Their accounts of the fear and suffering they experienced in the face of social discrimination, abuse, and moralistic religiosity were truly heartbreaking. They realized that change would be slow and that the strength of hatred for MSM was very strong. But unlike women and young people, they saw no benefits to them from culture and religion. And they also experienced no contradiction between claiming their rights and their economic survival, given that as adult men, their access to education and work was significantly greater than that of women and young people. I think the Zambian case study points to the poor fit between the worldview of human rights programmers and their beneficiaries. There's no doubt that social interventions are most effective when they resonate with the worldviews of target groupings. And there's an urgent need, we argue in the paper, for programs to engage in more careful dialogue with vulnerable groups, allowing for more flexible and context-specific implementation of framing of human rights and HIV programming, rather than, as I've said, the one-size-fits-all conceptualization, which commonly dominates. Moving on to my third study, this theme was closely echoed in a study of the difficulties that have faced the Ugandan marriage and divorce bill. And this is research I've done with Rochelle Burgess that was published in an article that came out last month. The context of our study is that many emphasize the need for government policies that support the promotion of women's rights in highly coercive settings. And the Ugandan Marriage and Divorce Bill seeks to strengthen women's agency in marriage. It was developed over many years by a group of Ugandan human rights lawyers and feminist activists. But the progress of the bill has faced many obstacles, including objections from many women themselves in public consultations. The bill is very long and complicated, but basically it's trying to increase women's agency to leave violent marriages. It suggests the abolition of the bride price, allowing women to leave violent husbands, allowing them to take their children with them, and giving them some material rights to take some material resources with them when they leave. Most relevant to our interests, let me just go back. Excuse me. Various factors hindered the progress of the bill. The nature of the public consultation progress, because the bill was taken to Parliament. The President objected vehemently to it. He said, I'm closing Parliament tomorrow. All of you MPs go back to your communities and consult your constituents on their views of the bill. Okay. Often the consultations were led by biased members of Parliament. The whole consultation exercise was backed by very vociferous and much reported opposition from the President and a lot of sensationalistic media reporting. But most relevant to the purpose of this particular paper were the objections of many women themselves in the public consult. And in the end, apparently, the overwhelming view of women in Uganda was that they did not want this bill. In interviews and focus groups that we did with Ugandan women, we found that they had very positive views of culture and custom. They saw traditional customs such as bride price as social signals of their value, a source of valued respect, protection, and social cohesion. They described the bill as a white and Western import, and I quote, useless and dangerous Bazungu ideas of rich, educated women in Kampala. And most women saw patriarchy as completely inevitable. They had no frame where they could see a world where patriarchy wasn't the dominant stamp. Their economic objections to the bill were strong. They argued that challenging men threatened women's economic survival, especially rural women. They said that particularly rural women said that the bill might be more attractive to their urban counterparts who had alternative sources of economic survival and social respect. As a woman said, will I be accepted back by my husband after using this bill to challenge him? Once I fall out with my husband, who will help me? If I was a Western woman, I could find jobs, lead a life without a man. Women spoke of how sexual compliance was essential for continued economic support. Because of the shame of reporting a husband for marital rape, it would be difficult to get married again. If you don't accept your husband's needs, who will look after you? Women also spoke of their lack of confidence in the law as an instrument of women's protection. They argued that the law could not be relied upon to protect women's interests. They spoke at length of police unwillingness to enforce laws that contradicted their own personal beliefs. I quote, if you go to a police officer and say I was raped, he does not see this as a problem because culturally in his experience a man is supposed to have access to however much sex he wants. And another, even when women can afford to go to the courts of law, they ask her to go back and mediate or to pray about it. I'll make some concluding comments, starting off with some lessons from the Uganda case study. I think that highlights the complexity of seeking political and legal solutions to problems that have their roots in complex constellations of political, economic, and cultural factors. And they highlight the shortcomings of conceptualizing gender in ways that assume common women's rights and interests. In a community in Uganda, there were clearly rural women, urban women, women human rights lawyers, and whatever, who all had really quite different positions in a way that made the notion of women's interests, which was assumed by the bill, not so helpful. In all the kind of controversy and debate that has followed the kind of rejection of the bill, it's still going. I mean, it went to Parliament, it was rejected, and hopefully the struggle will keep going. But a lot of people have talked about, I mean, one Ugandan MP who was very, very distraught said that this was a sign of the self-inflicted tyranny of women. And other people talked about women's democratic inexperience. However, I think that such a view arguably represents, well, what many would argue, such a view arguably represents a neoliberal and overly individualistic understanding of women's agency and a very decontextualized understanding of women's rights. Our studies suggest that programs seeking to empower women need to take a far more realistic approach to the likelihood that they'll be able or willing to openly assert their rights against men. And possibly that social change is more likely to take place through small piecemeal changes than via women openly challenging male power in open and confronting ways. What makes the mobilization of highly marginalized groups likely and potentially successful? I did a study with several colleagues a few years ago where we analyzed the success of 3 relatively successful rights struggles in the health and well-being field. We looked at the Treatment Action Campaign, we looked at the landless peasant workers movement in Brazil, and the People's Health movement in India. We concluded that all 3 programs had been successful in mobilizing both voice, the capacity and willingness of the marginalized to make vociferous demands, and receptive social environments, the willingness of powerful groups to hear these demands and support the creation of opportunities to implement them. Aside from men who have sex with men in Zambia, none of the groups in any of our studies were willing to make such demands. In many cases, the lack of receptive social environments is a key reason for this. Are human rights a nonsensically weak tool in the absence of political commitment from more powerful groups and economic alternatives to oppressive social relationships? Well, I think this depends on one's theory of change, and there's a lot of writing in the last 2 decades by the New Left who argue that social change is unlikely to come from the oppressed overthrowing the oppressors in grand strategies and gestures. Probably social change is more likely to come from slower and more fragmented patterns of small-scale change. Holloway argues that we need to resist the romanticism of what he calls outdated 20th century notions of radical social change, with change arising from the open engagement of marginalized individuals in projects of open resistance to the powerful. Many are increasingly arguing that the most significant social struggles will often be equally importantly tackled through small-scale and hidden acts of resistance located in small and barely visible cracks in the social order. Within this framework, one could argue that rights talk is introducing new ways of seeing in highly marginalized communities, ever so gradually in a sort of drip-drip kind of way, if not yet new ways of being and doing. And that over time, these might bear fruit for women, for young people, for highly marginalized groups. I'm not going to say much more because I started off by saying that my aim was to raise questions rather than to provide answers. So I'm not going to be tempted to provide any. But I do want to finish off with an optimistic quote from a male Ugandan women's champion. He says, "The country's rejection of this pro-women policy is just a temporary measure. Society can bury their head in the sand, but the body is out. The ostrich knows better. I think these setbacks are a step up for a comeback. Victory will come one day for this and many other progressive human rights struggles." Thank you very much.